In a world changed by time travel, you need an agency to deal with temporal crime. This is Timecop. Based upon ideas presented in Dark Horse's 1992 story, Timecop, A Man Out of Time, it was released in 1994 and stars Jean-Claude Van Damme. So let's dive into the wonderful world of time travel. Oh my god, I can't believe I said all that. This was not a time enforcement agency. This was a stupid. This is how their time machine appears to work. You get into this tiny little pod that then flies down a railway at high speeds because you have a gas burner on the back, and it propels you into a brick wall. This apparently flings you back into time through what can only be described as time's anus. What's more, you arrive on the other side without your pod? Apparently it goes through valet parking in the Phantom Zone or something. And you can only go backwards in time because if you go forward, stuff happens?
It's like Back to the Future, except moronic. So, let's try and get a basic idea of the plot.
Like, totally change time.
And that kind of summarizes the whole film.
Yeah, I don't fucking know.
They spend so much time developing these rules of time travel, but they don't really matter.
They're extremely pointless. We hear all about how you aren't supposed to change things in the past because of the butterfly effect. But the manner in which they apply the changes to the future is inconsistent.
And we don't get any explanation as to how they can return to the present if they can't travel forwards through time.
And no matter what, if you travel to the past, you're guaranteed to make a change.
Hell, that's the entire point to A Sound of Thunder.
Here's the problem with this film. They tried to touch upon some narrative themes, such as a story that ends at the beginning, as well as elements of the butterfly effect. And these themes are not easy to write. These are complex narrative subjects, and this film tries to use them for a very silly 90s action movie. It's not successful, and the end result is like if Memento was shot in the head.
Oh, this is crap. There are no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Look, I tend to understand time travel as a concept rather well. Admittedly, it tends to be one of my biggest pet peeves in fiction, but I understand it. There is a scene early on that just pissed me off. They start this movie off by angering me. Van Damme's character, whatever his name was, is, will be, Mullet Man, goes to the past to catch a guy who is investing in the stock market during the Depression in order to build capital in the future. On its own, this is a brilliant idea. One of the best in the movie. Anyway, the man is brought back to the future where he is sentenced to death. And they do it by sending him back to the past so he can fall to his death in a manner resembling a suicide. Do these idiots not see how leaving the corpse of a person from the future in the past could cause problems?
And keep in mind that this film actually touches upon one of my major pet peeves by directly stating what year it takes place in, and by extension, dating it. This film apparently takes place in the far-flung dystopian future of 2004. You know, the Bush years.
If you're going to set the movie in the future, you should probably either be vague about the date or give yourself a cushion of 20 plus years, so that by the time the film becomes obsolete, there will be at least some sense of nostalgia.
And going back to that earlier scene, when they transport the banker to the future, he was in the process of falling. But once he was in the future, that momentum seems to have been delayed or stored or something because he didn't come out of the portal with it. However, the moment they send him back to 1929, all of that momentum is returned.
This movie just finger-banged physics into submission, didn't it?
And what about the muscles from Brussels? His momentum is never paid back. Oh my god, it's like if Fringe was crapped out of time's anus.
Momentum can be deferred, but it must always be paid back in full. As I always said to Walter, physics is a bitch.
Oh dear God! It would be awesome if every time he arrived in a time plane, he just went flying off in a random direction.
Actually, all joking aside, that could be an interesting dilemma, if it was explored properly.
But it's not. Their grasp of physics, time, and science in general is about as tenuous as Van Damme's grasp on the English language.
Speaking of grasping Van Damme, why is it that his clothes are apparently allergic to him? He spends one of the early fight scenes doing splits in his underwear.
We'll get to the fight scenes in a bit. I want to finish talking about this can't travel to the future bullshit first. Their logic is that you can't travel to the future because it hasn't happened yet. But when they travel to the past, technically their present hasn't happened yet either. It is in constant flux, hence why their actions in the past can have an impact on it. So why can they return?
Wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey.
You know what? I'm bitching about time travel. You should not have characters loop back and interact with their younger selves because it becomes a clusterfuck of continuity. You do not do it because it results in me ranting and raging over Timecop.
And strangely enough, his argument seems to have looped back to where it started.
I understand your argument, but there are occasions where these types of plots can be well developed and result in a complex but properly constructed and logical storyline. The real issue here with the film is that it fails to be any of that. And as a result, it ends up being like 12 Monkeys' inbred cousin.
You're also not supposed to come in contact with your past self due to the logic that if the same matter occupies the same space, it will cause a temporal disruption.
That is the exact same argument that my Sunday school teachers used to make. If you touch yourself, the universe will collapse.
But this still makes no sense, because you're constantly leaving behind small particles of yourself everywhere you go. In theory, so much as breathing on your past self should be enough to cause a temporal meltdown. There are numerous occasions in this movie where Mullet Man must have come into contact with leftover particulate matter of his past self. Not to mention the fact that you're constantly changing. 1 nanosecond from another, your matter is different.
But let's move on to the fight scenes.
Oh, he was like a beautiful ballerina of death.
I can crush a walnut with my butt.
He keeps doing those splits as if it's part of his fighting style. If he's not careful, he's going to crush his soft green banana.
Why is it green?
As for the characters, well, we have Mullet Man.
Played by Jean-Claude, goddamn. To be fair, his acting wasn't horrible, and I could understand him.
And his fight scenes weren't that bad. Silly maybe, but not bad. We also had this internal affairs girl who was part of a weird backstabbing subplot.
Yeah, she had a role in all of the paradox crap.
Her involvement was kind of stupid, but at least it wasn't pointless. In the long run, her role was essentially to be some nice eye candy that didn't piss you off.
Then we have the wife who ends up having a significant role.
Listen.
Who are you?
It's me.
What? Your husband hasn't changed in the slightest!
His identity is protected by his mystical mullet.
Her character is mainly there for motivation. Finally, we have the villain, who admittedly has a pretty solid plan.
True, but it's hindered by the fact that he devours scenery across multiple timelines.
Plus, once he starts traveling back in time himself, everything seems to go to hell. But his initial plan to build funds so that he could become president was solid.
Still, I can't believe that he went back and personally gave himself advice.
That he didn't follow.
You do me a favor. Will you lay off the fucking candy bars?
And it's around this point that a myriad of new questions arise. Like, why is it that when a person goes to the past and makes a change, they retain their memories of how things originally were?
Kora, don't even start. You're about to touch upon the subject of paradoxes, and I don't even want to get into that. At this point, I'd like to see the Doctor, Marty McFly, and the T-800 beat the shit out of Mullet Man. That being said, it's possible that when a person makes a change, they create a divergent timeline separate from their original.
I understand the concept. Steins Gate featured that form of time travel prominently.
It's so cool!
But this film made no allusions to that being the case.
Instead of a bitch.
True, and one would assume that, if that was the case, they would brief their agents upon returning, so as to establish what impact their changes might have had. That way their agents wouldn't freak out when they accidentally step on a piece of gum in the 80s and Ronald Reagan was still president in the present.
Speaking of which, the Star Wars program is apparently quite effective.
Technically, the plot of this movie is really basic. It just gets confusing due to the seemingly arbitrary nature of the time travel. If they had established their laws and stuck to them, this film might have actually been pretty good.
And why is it that the villain can go back in time with 6 guys, but the government-run time enforcement agency only has a single 2-seater? The villain has an SUV, but the cops have a smart car?
Evil Bay had a special rebate discount.
Maybe it's part of the government's attempt to move towards green time travel.
We should just throw the director into a concrete wall so that he can go back and fix this movie.
Who the hell puts a concrete wall at the end of their time catapult?
To be fair, it might be part of the device. It's never really established whether the wall served a purpose or not.
Still, what if the power cuts off and the pod goes careening into it?
Then it becomes Darwinism at work.
The establishment of the Timecop agency was interesting, and served as an interesting way for the film to kick off, but everything that followed that was just frustrating.
Still, I'm kind of willing to admit that we're underselling it, because while it was bad in a fun and kind of silly way.
There were some humorous elements present, but it mainly pissed me off.
Well, I just can't get angry about this one.
This movie... it pisses me off. Because I love time travel, both within fiction and as a theoretical concept. I hate it when something attempts to use time travel as part of its plot and fails so miserably that my brain starts reenacting the scene from Scanners on repeat. I can take schlock and I can take crap, but then you have Timecop. This isn't a horror movie, it's just the fact that it's centered around time travel that pisses me off. Characters are bland and generic. It's a 90s action movie. What do you expect? The fight scenes are okay, and the special effects aren't that bad. This movie is a turd blossom. It's got some interesting visuals, and it's kind of entertaining. But at its heart, it's just crap. That's 3 out of 10.
I think this film could have been more entertaining if there was not so much to it. Instead, we have a movie that is so full of plot holes, so vast that you could use them as wormholes through time and avoid the valet service altogether. The effects were okay. There were a number of god-awful green screen effects, but the villain was fun in a chewing scenery sort of way, and when they weren't relying on gunplay, the fight scenes were decent. As a result, it's a shitty movie, but it's still entertaining, so it's a turd blossom. 3 out of 10.
This movie is so fucking exhausting, both mentally and physically. The time travel is bullshit, and the science is so stupid that it's like watching the Terminator franchise get lobotomized. Jean-Claude Van Damme is Jean-Claude Van Damme. His wife is surrounded with moronic dialogue that makes you wonder how she puts on her clothes in the morning. She can't recognize her husband despite the fact that his biggest change in the past 10 years has been to grow his hair out a little. God damn. This movie is bad. It was crap. The Time Enforcement Agency should put out a shoot-to-kill order on this film. On that note, I'm going to give this a turd blossom. Despite myself, I enjoyed some of the silly fight scenes, so I can't really condemn it any more than that. That's 3 out of 10.
Time travel is a tricky subject, and one that needs to be approached intelligently. And this film just isn't that. This film ended up being rather annoying because it couldn't decide whether it wanted to be a stupid, silly action film or a more intellectually inclined sci-fi film. As a result, it failed at both. It couldn't decide whether time travel should simply be a framing device or the central focus. And this led to its science being jumbled and vague. That being said, I don't think that I hated it as much as everybody else in the group. I felt it was kind of funny, albeit in a rather unintentional way, but funny nonetheless. I didn't think it was boring, it was short, and sure, it was stupid as a lobotomized cinder block, but I'll give it a turd blossom with an offhand recommendation if you happen to have a good group of friends to mock it with. That's 3 out of 10.
Well, before turd blossoms, the MediaWhorz rating is a unanimous turd blossom. So everyone, let's leave with a jump to the left.
Mystical mullet.